I would like to move to Christian Stadler. Christian has a website which I invite you to look because it has full of resources called christianstadler.org. That goes on for about 17 pages. So if I start listing all his achievements, we just are done with the time. So just want to say that he is one of our superstars in the business school. And as I said, he has the uncanny capacity to make high profile academic work, but also to be able to speak to practitioners. He is one of the most cited and most present academics, British academics on social media. And it traditionally deals with competitive advantage and what makes a company be longevity, so survive over time. And I have to say, most of the times he get it right. But reviewing his page today, he had a very interesting article in the media that is called Why Our Brexit is Dead, Here is Why. So even Christian Stadler sometimes get it wrong because he looks at how Brexit is coming our way. But that's very encouraging for some lowly person like me that even people like Christian sometimes get it wrong. So Christians, the floor is yours. It would be great if you could share with us the results of your more recent research in the role leader in competitive advantage. And thank you again for contributing.
Okay, thanks, Davide. You know, this kind of makes me blush, yeah, the introduction that you give me. Of course, it can only be a letdown from now. I'm glad that among all of you, I saw one familiar face, Ian, who has been on the DBA program that I've been running in the previous years, has joined us. So at least sort of, you know, one guy in my court to start the whole thing. I've kind of almost have to add to this letdown in the sense that something got lost in translation. I'm not going to talk about leadership as such. I'm going to talk about open strategy. Now, there is an aspect of, you know, personal involvement. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how individuals can play a role here, but it's not a leadership talk as such. So if you guys came for a leadership talk, this is the time to leave because it's not going to be one of those. If not, you know, I would suggest we start putting up the slides. Luis, I think you can control them for me. I'm in Zanzibar and the bandwidth here is not always that great, so I thought it's better if somebody else is handling the slides, and Luis can do that. In the meantime, while she's doing that and getting it started, to give you a sense already what I want to do, I'm hoping in that half an hour that I have that I can achieve 4 things, yeah? The first one is up here already, is I want to convince you that the way you've been doing strategy in the last 30 years is not really the way forward, and is kind of, you know, full of faults that can potentially not work out the way that you want them. The second thing I want to do is I want to then try to show you how open strategy can help you to become better in the execution of your strategy. Something that might be a bit less sexy than the creation of new ideas, but is often the key to success. The third thing I want to do is I want to talk about how open strategy can help you to generate new breakthrough ideas. And the last thing, if at that stage you are kind of still with me and you are sort of attuned with the idea that open strategy could be something, I want in the last part of the 30 minutes talk a little bit about how you individually can make yourself ready to lead open strategy and how you can get that done. So do these slides kind of jump by itself, or I can tell that to these? Okay, well, it's actually a good time to move on to the first slide. And I want to talk to you, sorry, move on to the next slide, I mean, yeah. I want to start with taking you down the lane of history a little bit. If in 1985, imagine you would have worked for Daimler and had produced cars of that kind, you would have had a really fantastic job then. Your neighbors would certainly be a bit jealous that you landed this fantastic job. And as you drive home, your big fat Mercedes in the evening and park it outside your house, your neighbor would probably come over and want you to have a chat with you, trying to figure out how he or she can also get a job to work for Daimler. Now in 1987, something fundamentally shifted. A new CEO came in place, Edzard Reuter, and he had this idea that the future of Daimler could not be guaranteed if you just stay as a producer of premium cars. That you really had to transform yourself into a, what he called a integrated technology conglomerate, where he started to make acquisitions in the more industrial side, for example, acquiring AG, a company that was relatively similar to Siemens, where he moved the company into the production of flight engines as well, where he acquired a IT consulting company, and where he also moved into the defense industry. Now you might think, you know, what's the big deal about this? Only that actually 1985 is not so far away from the Second World War, and being a producer of weapons or material that was used in the defense industry was actually still a pretty big deal in Germany. So suddenly the newspapers were full of articles where, you know, Daimler is engaged in sort of activities that is killing children all over the world, horrible stuff. Now, no longer is it quite so cool to actually work for Daimler. Now, when you drive home, you actually wait until it's dark. You park the car not in front of your house, but you park it behind so you can sneak in and don't meet your neighbors. Your wife or your husband is not so proud of you either, because all the friends are pestering her, what's going on? Why is your husband working for this horrible company? Now you can imagine, you know, that this is not just a nuisance in your daily life. It will also make you less enthusiastic to actually cooperate with people who sit in other parts of the business, particularly if they're in the defense business. You will not really kind of look out for opportunities to cooperate with them and bring up new ideas. But the entire idea about these deals was that we'll have all this cross-fertilization across the different divisions. The result of those sort of grand plan of Edzard Reuter was that eventually he was asked to leave the company, and Daimler had to declare a loss of 5.7 billion D-Mark, which was the biggest loss any company had since the Second World War. On paper, the strategy had looked great, but in reality, it turned out to be not quite so well working out. Now you might think, you know, that's 30 years ago, and just because some guy who was clearly charismatic, yeah, I have to admit, I've met him for a coffee in Berlin in 2001, and as we sort of talked about this strategy, I felt myself being convinced that what he was doing was actually all on the right track, yeah, and it sort of just stumbled because of some evil spirit somewhere, because he didn't have enough time, because it didn't work out, the market conditions were not quite right. But downfalls of that kind, when smart people, executives who you couldn't blame for, you know, having great bold ideas, somehow fall flat, happens continuously. A more recent example would be GE's downfall from grace, that between 2001 and 2017 had lost, I need to look up the numbers for a second, they've lost, they went down from a 29% return on capital to a 6.2% return on capital. Between 2010, after the financial crisis, and 2017, their share price lost 7% of the value, whereas the share price of the S&P 500 in that period went up by 150%. Yeah. Now, clearly something had gone wrong. What was it? So Jeff Immelt, who was in charge of the company, had a taste for bold moves. He orchestrated a number of massive acquisitions. In fact, he prided himself of making the most acquisitions that any CEO of GE had ever made. And he thought that with the legacy of operational excellence that GE had, that they would be able to pull that off, integrate these companies, make them more efficient as they join GE. The broad thrust of a big part of that strategy was that they will become the digital platform for industry. And that, as a plan, there was nothing wrong. It was a good idea, but the devil is in the detail. One of the DBA students, in fact, who was running a plant for GE in the Midlands, was sharing a story that kind of highlights how things go wrong. So as GE was on this track to getting digital, they developed these fantastic apps where you can track everything. And they got an iPad in the factory to kind of run things more smoothly. Only that they had no Wi-Fi connection in the factory. Yeah? Some of these small details made stuff stumble, didn't make it work. That kind of part is easily overlooked in strategy. Many people think that strategy is about a few big ideas and everything else will fall into place. In reality, strategy is often about hundreds, maybe even thousands of small things, small decisions that all need to fit together and create a web that has to succeed. That's why I propose that a more open approach towards strategy is in fact a better way to create strategy than the traditional way of having a few notably smart executives sit together and come up with big plans, because it requires an entire organization not to just fall in line, but to think along, to have ideas of why certain things might work and might not work. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. I want to highlight that point also based on some surveys that we relied on. Some we did ourselves, some of that we collected, and others had done the survey that shows us that we really can't blame CEOs for not thinking about this enough. CEOs spend about 20% of their time looking at strategy and thinking about strategy. This is based on Michael Porter conducting a study where he followed, well, not himself, one of his research assistants, followed around CEOs to record in great detail what they did with all their time. Yeah, so 20%, 22% of their time they actually spend on creating and thinking about strategy. But nonetheless, we know from a survey that we conducted that executives think that about 52% of the strategic initiatives that they start somehow don't work out. Yeah, and that has to do with the problems in execution. It has to do with silo thinking in the organization. It has to do with ideas that look great when you first think about them, really not quite working how the world develops afterwards, yeah, because it is so difficult to predict what's happening. So I want to now dive a little bit into the details of how open strategy might help you to deal first with the execution side of things, and secondly then with the idea side of things. And I deliberately start with the execution side of things because that's often the one that is left as an afterthought, but it is that integration between execution and coming up with a strategy where so often things go wrong. So if I can move on to the next slide, please. As I said, I want to look in that second part of my talk into the execution. Next slide, please. And I want to start with a story from Barclays. Barclays retail more specifically, when Ashok Vaswani took over the running of the retail business in the UK in 2012. Now, at the time when he arrived there, he was aware that probably things for retail banking are going to change and going to change fast. We have seen in other industries that the whole wave of digitalization is upending the traditional way of how business was done and could be done. We've seen it in the newspaper space of how digital is really undercutting the way how they can make money. We have seen it for music even early on, where people started to download, more recently stream music rather than buy CDs. Now in his space, even though he knew that the big headline will be, we need to somehow figure out what to do with digitalization and early signs of mobile happening. But he also knew that if he just kind of, brings in a few smart executives and they dream some ideas up, this is not likely going to get much traction out there in the field. And it doesn't help people in how they kind of translate these things into their workspace. They had a large legacy organization which you couldn't just throw out of the boat. Yeah, it was not as if they were creating a new startup, so they somehow needed to work with that. Knowing that, he set up a very different process of coming up with solutions. In a first step, he put together working groups, which were fairly large and involved around 60 people that came up with bigger headlines of what might be the right trajectories to take. In the second step, then, he had a team of his, which involved some of the representatives that came up with the first big ideas that were also reflected with the executives in the retail business, to come up with I would call it a digital conference. Yeah, more technically the term is a strategy jam. But they organized a setup where over a short period of time, a week to be more precise, the entire Barclays retail organization of 30,000 people would be involved in discussing how these bigger headlines could be translated for them. Yeah, you can think of it in, you know, a variety of breakout rooms where people would gather around topics around things that would reflect on them, and then kind of start to think of solutions that were relevant for them if, broadly speaking, they would like to make the organization more digital. And, you know, things came up like in the mortgage team that they started to discuss, you know, we see Domino's Pizza, where when you order pizza, they can tell you, now I've come your order in, now the pizza is in the oven, now it is with the driver, now it's going to arrive with you. When we do a mortgage application, that was in 2012, we can only tell people we have received your mortgage application, and at the very end we can tell them you get a mortgage, you can't, or you will not get a mortgage. But we can't keep them up to date. We can't do that at the moment. Yeah. So clearly, you know, we have to translate and make these changes. It is not the big thing that happened, is the many small changes in the energy the entire retail organization had around those topics that made Barclays a leader among the retail, large retail banks in the UK in digitalization. They now have the largest group of millennials that bank with them. They are the most, they are the retail bank which has the most mobile banking traction, with about 70% of their customers regularly using mobile banking. And in that difficult period, their return on equity has gone up from 15 to 17%. So the performance itself has gone up as well. As for Ashok Vaswani, he has also done well out of this. Yeah, this was such a big success that he has since been promoted 3 times. So, you know, clearly this is also something, if you want to lead in that space, you can get some attention, and you can also potentially move yourself up in this world. Now, this is something that, you know, works also in places where you think secrecy is high on the agenda. For example, I've recently talked to the top policy maker in the Pentagon in as far as NATO is concerned, and they've just recently run a big jam among NATO partners and the EU to come up with ways to better deal with the security threats in the era where COVID is striking. And this, as he put it, yeah, is in a space where really consensus finding is vital, because you move in a sort of glacial space if you're doing policy making. But in that sort of glacial space, some relatively big things have started to happen, where, for example, there has been a more unified opinion among those countries after jam involving about 1,800 people plus 150 what they call super VIPs, so ministers, etc., that we have to concentrate more deliberately on the security threat that comes from China and Russia in particular. And that, you know, was not a given at all, where there were very kind of country-specific agendas previously. As I said, it's a small pace that it moves, but that kind of, you know, collective strategy formulation makes it more likely that anything moves at all in this particular space. And we can move to the next slide, please. There's also some evidence from the survey that we conducted that strategy execution works much better when you do it in an open process. So what we heard from the participants in that survey is that 70% of them think that open strategy increases the commitment that people have towards strategy. And that's a big move. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Well, you know, that's particularly important when, you know, you might kind of think that, well, you know, maybe this is just really about communication. People don't know what's going on. I don't think that can be the full picture. When you ask middle managers, 90% of them say that they actually hear managers, meaning top managers, speak about strategy frequently enough. Nonetheless, only 29% of them were able to pick out the correct strategy out of 6 different choices. Yeah. So just because we hear stuff often enough doesn't mean we're really into it. The concept that is pushed sometimes in the academic literature here is that we need psychological ownership of a strategy. That people, without being involved, they don't feel that psychological ownership, and they're not going to be champions. Not because of malice, because often they don't understand it, they don't know how that translates to what they have to do. So involve them and get better execution results. Let's move on to the next slide. So the third point, as I said, I want to talk a little bit also about how open strategy can help you to actually come up with new and fresh ideas that under normal circumstances you might miss. Next slide, please. And I want to, make this profitable for you in the sense that we're literally going to see how you can dig for gold and dig for gold on the internet. So the company I have in mind here is Goldcorp. That's a Canadian mining or gold mining company that was acquired by Rob McEwen, who was a rather unusual character for the mining industry. So he was not an engineer by background, but he was a banker. He has been working for most of his career as an investment banker for Merrill Lynch, and his demeanor was very much a professorial one. Sort of, a brainy guy who was thinking carefully about solutions, not a hands-on type of guy that often you find in this industry. At the time when he took over the mine, the company, there was a mine in the Red Lake district that's in Canada, which had been producing gold for about 50 years. And the engineers kind of have gotten to the end of their wisdom. They thought there's about 3 years worth of gold still there, but that's it. Everything they tried hadn't worked. Now, not Ian McEwen, that's the famous author, Rob McEwen, was somehow intrigued by the fact there were a number of other gold mines in the region who were still more productive, and he thought there must be a bit more out there in my mine as well. He attended a seminar in MIT where people came to share thoughts about their own experience in strategy development in different industries. And there was one person there who shared the whole Linux experience about open source, and how you kind of, by involving others, sometimes get to solutions that you would not on your own. He was quite intrigued by that, went back and decided that he will put the entire data that he has about this mine online and open a contest inviting people to come up with suggestions of how they could find gold in this particular mine. Now, if you're not in mining, you might not kind of realize how revolutionary this was. People thought this guy is a maniac. He's completely crazy. He's out of his mind. He's giving away the biggest secret that he wouldn't even share with your mother usually to the entire world. He was not deterred by that. In the end, he got 1,400 scientists globally to participate from 50 different countries to download this data. And he got a winning team from Australia, which came up with a very detailed 3D modeler that was making propositions that they actually decided to go after. And they drilled 4 out of the 5 targets that were identified by this team, which were all of them, they drilled 4 out of the 5 targets, and in each of them, they hit gold. Compared to previous years, production went up 10-fold for the mine. So amazing success by opening to a wider group of people and coming up with entirely fresh ideas. Now, some of you I might realize might not be comfortable to put all of this online, but you can also find formats to open up your strategy in a more controlled workshop type environment. A company, IMP, that's a German consulting company I've been working with on a book on this very topic that will come out next year, has developed some of those formats. One of them, which I find particularly interesting, is a nightmare competitor format, where the IMP brings together a equal share of people from within the company and from outside the company to come up and develop a fictional company that doesn't exist, that would create a nightmare competition for your organization. They do that in a stepwise process where you first kind of think broadly about ideas that could threaten you, and then slowly narrow it down in a kind of a dragon den atmosphere where teams pitch the ideas against each other and you select some which seem to be more promising, then have a smaller group of topics with larger teams to work on, to develop detailed business models, and then eventually pitch that to the top management team, where then you find companies sometimes seeing that as a preparation to how they kind of need to defend against this, sometimes also taking this on and developing their own proposition that really takes a business model and translates it into reality. For example, First Alpine, that's an Austrian steel company and one of the largest ones in Europe, ran through such an exercise and came up with the idea of creating CO2-free steel. Now, it's not that this hasn't been an idea that hasn't popped up in the company before, but they have not developed a detailed business model around this. Since then, they have actually put the largest pilot plant that produces CO2-free steel up in the world, and is leading in a space that, you know, we don't know yet where it goes. There's no results because this has a cycle where it probably takes another 10 years to fully see that, but they've clearly taken leadership in a technological space that is promising, that is in sync with the requirements of our time, because they've taken such an open approach and have engaged with the detailed discussion that also, again, you know, brought people from different parts within their company into the idea generation and made them natural champions to that. Let's move on to the next slide. You know, once again, a bit of data here. We have seen that from the respondents we got from the survey that we conducted with, this was, by the way, I think a good 200 top executives across the world, that 96% of them think that the number and diversity of ideas increases substantially when you open up your strategy process. Let's move on to the next slide. So the last thing I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about, you know, how can you get yourself into this? How can you be ready for that? Now, this is clearly for those guys who are still with me mentally and think, yes, open strategy might really make sense for me. There's a nice little tool which, you know, I can happily share a link to you after where we conducted or created a little test where you can see yourself if you're in the right mindset to open up and be ready for open strategy, so to speak. Now, what it essentially kind of allows you to see is if you're somebody who is comfortable with the idea that you're not just somebody who creates strategy, but orchestrate, and others will be much more involved in that creation. It kind of gives you a sense when you've done that, whether you are comfortable also with uncertainty, with serendipity, with sometimes things and ideas coming out not through regular channels, where you're comfortable with a little bit less hierarchy also in your organization, whether you are prepared to involve people who are more from the front line, whether you have a mindset that doesn't always think of reasons why things will not work, but why things actually might have a chance. It is in a way a little bit of a test of you, whether you are somebody who is more a bit like a jazz musician, a Miles Davis kind of personality, or you're more of a sort of traditional concert type person who likes structure and a clear way to move forward. If we can move on to the next slide. We've also then looked on, well, you know, does it actually make a difference if our leaders have a closed or open mindset? And we have seen here that the likelihood that a company actually conducts open strategy goes up quite a bit between having leaders that have a closed mindset, where the chance is that 37% of their strategic initiatives have a bit more of an open taste, whereas when the leaders have an open mind, then open mindset, then 48% of those strategic initiatives are of an open type. Now, you think, is that a big jump? In fact, I think it's a massive jump from 37 to 48%. First of all, I don't think that every single initiative within your company should be an open strategy, but that a large amount of them might benefit for them. So you might, deal with a acquisition decision where clearly, there's even legal reasons why often you can't open this up to a wider audience. But there's many other things where you should. It is also quite crucial because the difference in mindset between closed and open was quite a small one. In our survey, where we had a score from 0 to 5, the mean score was below 2.7 for those that had a closed mindset. For those that had an open mindset, it was above 3. So there was only a 0.3 difference in how the overall value, when they conducted that survey testing their mindset, differentiated those between a closed and an open mindset. Now, what if you're a closed person, but you would like to become more of an open one? I have some suggestions for that as well. We're not there yet, so we can go back to the previous slide still. I have some suggestions there as well of how you can open yourself a little more. So first thing you can do, now in Austria we have this lovely tradition that goes back, and I'm Austrian, I might have not mentioned it before, that goes back to the 1800s, where people meet in the evening in discussion circles, and some of the great ideas that came out in the psychology field from Austria around the Viennese circle is from these discussion groups, where people come together from very different disciplines with very different backgrounds and have discussions, because that opens your mind. Now, how can you translate that in your own world? Invite people that are different from you and, meet up with them, have discussions, talk about God and the world, so to speak. It doesn't need to be always specifically about the things that are on your plate, but that opens your mind. The second thing you can do is spend a bit more time with people who are at the front line of your business. Talk to them to find out what they think works, why certain ideas that come from corporate headquarters, possibly from yourself, are just not practical out there in the operational space. It will give you new and fresh ideas. And the third thing that I'd recommend is read widely. Now, it might sound kind of, like a weird suggestion, but when you look at some of the most successful individuals, Bill Gates, for example, they read a lot and widely. I've seen a documentary about him recently, and wherever he goes, he carries this massive canvas bag with him, where he has about 20 different books. It doesn't mean that he reads all of them, but he reads a lot, and he reads widely. The same is true for Elon Musk. His brother said once that he's one of the fastest readers he has come across, and he does read constantly and regularly and widely, not just in the core space of where you're active. So let's go to the last slide. So I hope that you've taken away 4 things from my talk today. The first one is that in many circumstances, the more closed way of doing strategy will not produce the results that you're looking for. It is often stumbling execution, but also the ideas that look great on paper. Once the world is changing and fast paced, you might not pick up the signals. You're more likely to listen to people who are similar to yourself. You benchmark yourself against the companies that are similar to yourself, and you're less likely to pick up ideas that are entirely different from the space that you know. So in order to solve that, I suggest you open up your strategy a little bit more. On the execution side, the benefits are immediately obvious, I think, where involving people will make them think about how the strategy translates in their own space, and they're more likely to become champions of your strategy. In the idea side, there's been a lot of evidence in open innovation, where I'm sure many of you have had experience yourself, that opening up works quite well, but it does work likewise in a strategy space. There's less experimentation in that space, but it can be done. It can be done in a way that your secrecy is not in danger. We have interviewed somebody who is working for the US Navy, and they have used open strategy to create new ideas for the Navy. Now, if in such a sensitive environment you can open up your strategy, I'm sure that most of you don't have to deal with the potential of national security threats. Finally, I've also tried to briefly lay out how you personally can get yourself into open strategy and open up your mind. Try to do things that maybe you don't do usually. Experiment a little bit. Keep yourself, not too skeptical about new things, but just give them a go. That will open the way for open strategy. Thank you very much.
So thank you very, very much, Christian. To all participants, as you can notice, when you let an academic have more than 15 minutes, you know that it's going to go on for much more than that. But
how long did I go on? I didn't have a clock. That was part of my problem.
Yes, but it doesn't matter. I think you had so many interesting stories, and I didn't want to stop you. It was really, really informative. Thank you very much. I think given some of the audience, I think one of the messages hidden in Christian's talk was that many of the tools of knowledge management, creativity that we use usually to improve operational issues, which is where a lot of the people in this call are positions, can actually be used successfully, increasingly, to improve the strategy making process. And this is a way in which you should approach, or an argument that you can use to approach your top managers, and says, I can help you to do things that you do better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. All these sort of social media tools also that organizations use in many ways already, they are tools that could be used very well in the strategy space. And some companies do that. Yeah. Unilever, for example, had used their social media platform to increasingly actually engage in strategic questions. For example, in preparation to their annual summit, where the top leaders discuss strategy, because they notice this is just more effective, and you can't kind of just people shut out. Less so as more and more people are used to being involved in debates via social media in all other ways of life.
So thank you, Christian. I think for many, I hope this will open some aha moment of things, new ways to position yourself with regard to your top managers.
And if you permit me, David, next year in autumn, there'll be a MIT Press book on all of this. So I hope you haven't forgotten entirely about this and feel enthused enough to read a bit more about this.
Thank you again, Christian. We are running a little bit short of time.